happened, it would be no longer possible to do something incredibly more in the
This is really just free association. I think one of the crucial things is that period when we were having the last Anzacs and the last World War I veterans dying, and they were frail old men, and that sentimentalised the process. Whereas back in 1960, with the play The One Day of the Year, these men were still quite well enough to go down to the RSL and get blind drunk by lunchtime and be rather unpleasant to be around. So there was a reaction. There was a reaction there. So I guess that's probably the 90s for Anzac, and I think it's happening. And I think it's now the Second World War veterans are doing the same sort of thing. They're sort of old monuments, and so I think it's actually started before Howard, but Howard certainly amplified it. I think it started in the approximately when Keating became Prime Minister, if it's fully connected to federal politics. But it's really a research question, and that's just my hunch.
Any other?
Just raised a question about the relationship between the editorial line and the cartooning line. It's sometimes argued by the proprietors or the editors that the cartoonists are completely independent in the stand they take on issues of the day. And others say, of course, that the cartoonists are very aware of the editorial line and comply with it. What's your impression?
My impression is that the cartoonists are not held to an editorial line. Any sensible editor knows that the cartoonist's first job is to be funny, so to be successful. So that's the first part of the answer. But on the other hand, as an editor, you also get to employ cartoonists. Now, there is a day in 1976 when it says in the Australia's foremost cartoonist is coming to the Australian, Larry Pickering. That's the last day a cartoon by Bruce Petty appears in the Australian. And and so Pickering is very much more a paper in tune with the posts. A good cartoonist in his way, not to my taste particularly, but a very powerful cartoonist in his way, in tune with the paper in that era. I don't hear any stories from the cartoonists that they're held to particular editorial lines. But editors can refuse particular cartoons, but they nearly always have to have some sort of explanation.
Yes, I mean, you could say, would the current Australian be likely to employ a pen? I mean, that's to say, is the choice of cartoonists knowing their work a function of the ideological mindset of the paper?
Yeah, I think that connects with what I'm saying about ethos. I think Paul Kelly was deliberately trying to stretch the Australian when he employed Peter Nicholson and let Bill Leake loose in the early to mid-90s, and the cartoonists for that period were often at odds with the direction of the paper. It seems to me Bill Leake is now quite in tune with the ethos of Chris Mitchell's paper, but I think that's something that's changed in him. I don't think anyone who's met Bill, it's not possible to enforce that on him. But on the other hand, it's brought out a sense that he's always been a cartoonist who plays the man rather more intensely than he plays the ideas. In that sense, he's very different from Hetty. So, yeah.
Thanks very much, Robert. That was terrific. And the final speaker today, Lisa Waller from journalism at Deakin University in Melbourne. And I'll do your disclosure for you. A former journalist with The Australian. And Lisa and Kerry McCallum have been doing work over quite a few years now on the media coverage of Indigenous issues, and the focus of the paper today is on The Australian's pursuit of Indigenous affairs.
Thank you. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement today, and that's an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the Sydney region. So I'd just like to pay my respects to the elders past and present. I was born on the shores of the harbour here on the northern side of it, and I don't get back here that often, and it's just lovely to be back in this country, even while it's brief and, you know, I'm not out there on a ferry, but yeah, it's lovely to be here. Just a bit of a roadmap by introduction to let you know what I'm going to skip through today. So I'd just like to start by talking about the project that Kerry and I have been working on with a team of other researchers for some time, a few historical reflections, and then really into talking about the Australians' role in reporting Indigenous affairs in Australia, and talking about Noel Pearson. So that's basically where I'm going with this today. So yeah, I can do that. So first of all, just to talk about the project, the Media and Indigenous Policy Project, from bicentenary to apology, that was the policy timeframe that Kerry chose to investigate. Kerry was the chief investigator on this project, and it had a number of aims, which you can see there. I could talk for a long time about the project. I won't do that today. There is this preliminary report that you can access through the Research Centre's website, and there are also a number of academic and mainstream media publications that we've written over that 5-year period, and I will be drawing on some of those papers today. So if people are interested in a particular aspect of the work that I'm talking about today, we can probably direct you to something that we've written about. At the very beginning of the project, we all decided that it would be a good idea to look back a bit further than the 88 to 2008 frame, and I actually did a little bit of work up looking at Daisy Bates. I'm not going to talk about that today. There is a paper, but I just thought it was really worth mentioning that the Murdoch interest in Indigenous affairs goes back a long way. So one of the things that I did discover in that early research was that Bates was paid in the 1930s, I think it was in 1939, she wrote a big series of articles for the Adelaide Advertiser, which was basically the book The Passing of the Aborigines, where she really rolled out the whole, soothing the pillow of a dying race idea. It was so influential, back in that policy period. £500 she was paid in advance, and she actually boasted to her British publisher that the Adelaide Advertiser, which as we know is closely associated with Sir Keith Murdoch, that she was paid more than Generals Monash and Haig for their wartime diaries for that body of journalism. So that's a serious investment, a long way back in Murdoch time. The image that you have here, Kerry's done some work, as has Michelle Dunbreen at the University of Newcastle, on Rupert Murdoch's own interest in reporting Indigenous affairs. So the image you can see there is from the Adelaide News in the mid-1950s, and Rupert had actually got on a plane and gone out to have a look on the ground at the effects of the Maralinga atomic testing, and you can see there for yourself. That's one of Rupert's reports. So, when we come to talking about the early years of the Australian, I think it's really worth just looking at that broader Murdoch context. This is a long time commitment to a focus on Indigenous affairs. Again, it's probably difficult for you to see, but what we have over on the left-hand side here is an early editorial from the Australian on the referendum, and we've had quite a lot of talk here over the last couple of days about those early, heady, progressive days. So here we can see that Dennis Kroll has written about the Australians supporting the yes vote in the referendum, and taking, the wonderful step of employing John Newfong as the first mainstream Aboriginal journalist. So we're going back a long time. I'd like to move into talking about our work now. So we've looked at the Australian across the 5-year period. We can't ignore it. And the reason we can't ignore it is because it is the keystone media on Indigenous affairs. So for us to be trying to understand the news media's broader impact on Indigenous policymaking in Australia, we really need to understand the Australian. And again, you know, we've written some papers about how do you measure that? You know, Robert Mann, lots of people talk about the Australian as this big influential thing. We've actually been quite interested in looking at the mechanisms behind that. So, you know, how do you measure the weight of something in terms of journalism? And you know, some of the factors are linked to production, so things like the number of exclusives, the rate of articles being picked up by other outlets, the size of the specialist staff, the editorial space generally that's given to an issue, the size of the audience, and obviously the audience's profile. So clearly on all of those markers, the Australian, you know, absolutely, you know, is the standout there. So this idea of Keystone Media, which is a concept that Rasmus Nielsen's writing about at the moment, is about, obviously, you know, not how big you are, but about your effect on the wider environment. You know, it's quite a good conceptual, you know, tool for thinking about a paper like The Australian. I'm going to move to some of the quantitative data that we have out of the project, and I don't really want to get bogged down in this, but I think it's quite good for actually getting a good snapshot of what the field is like and how the Australian rates. And I have to say that these are only little tiny snapshots. There's a very big data set. So, you know, there are many other graphs and many other examples. So this is really just to give you you know, an idea. So as the slide says there, basically the Australian media pays relatively little attention to Indigenous health, and I should also say that most of these slides do relate to health reporting, which is what Kerry's part of the project looked at. So we're looking at health, but our argument would be that it's quite reflective of reporting across other policy and Indigenous policy domains. And as you can see from there, the Australian dominates that that news coverage. So our research is showing basically that the Australian was the only newspaper that consistently reported on Indigenous health, and certainly all of the people that we interviewed told us that it was the Australian, you know, bureaucrats that we interviewed. It was the Australian that they were listening to. Other journalists from other major news organisations were telling us it's the Australian that gets listened to, and people just understood that very much as its agenda-setting role in the field. So people told us what our analysis of the coverage told us too. The next graph shows what we call a shallows and rapids reporting style. So again, this is just 2006, but there, you know, are graphs like this for every year, and we can tell you that this is, you know, this is the pattern. So basically, very little attention gets paid to Indigenous health, but when it does, it spikes like that. And Kerry's research would indicate very strongly that when that does happen, the coverage is intense, it tends to be sensationalist, and as you can see, it's fairly short-lived. It just goes back into the shallows again. This is an interesting and important graph for us because, as you can see, what it's showing there is that politicians, you know, for all of the papers that we're looking at there, are the people that are you know, quoted the most. You know, what that tells us is that Indigenous policy, rather than being a social policy, it's a political issue. So Indigenous health is a political issue. You've got your medical experts are the next most quoted people. And once again, you know, how is it framed? Crisis, you know, failure of government policy, lots of talk about Indigenous people's individual responsibility for their health. And so we see this kind of reporting where, yeah, Indigenous people are basically, you know, responsible for their own health. It's we don't get a lot of reporting of the structural reasons for some of the health problems that are encountered. The next slide shows here that there's a very narrow range of spokespeople on Indigenous health. So across that period, you can see who was being quoted. And then we move to the next graph, which zeroes in on the Australian. So while the Australian quoted Indigenous voices in news about Indigenous health more frequently than the other papers on that graph that you can see there, you know, what is very clear is that Noel Pearson overwhelmingly dominates that coverage. So he was reported nearly twice as often on Indigenous health as Mick Dodson, who was Australian of the Year in 2009. So it's just very clear. It's Pearson. I now just want to move on and talk a little bit about neoliberalism, the state and the news media. And I'm really aware of the time, so I don't want to, you know, be giving people a big lecture here about neoliberalism. But I am at pains to say that we're using it in quite a precise way. So there's been quite a lot of criticism in media and communications study of neoliberalism being a term that just kind of gets tossed around to mean anything that's kind of negative or a bit right-wing, and that's not the way that we're using it at all. So we're using it in a very precise way, really just to talk about the adoption of market-based technical solutions to what we regard as complex, deeply entrenched and diverse development problems. So it's finding market-based solutions, you know, to social problems. So a lot of our research is looking at this intersection between neoliberal government policy, and as the slide says there, we've moved, you know, closer and closer to that kind of market-based technical solution from government. There's been a lot of talk today, particularly about the Australian, moving further toward having that kind of neoliberal agenda. So we're starting to look at that intersection of where you've got the media and governments basically advocating, you know, one policy line. Neoliberalism is a really interesting thing too, because you know, we talk a little bit about hegemony, and hegemony works best on uneven ground. So you need a bit of struggle, you need a bit of opposition for it to really work. And neoliberalism itself represents this ongoing struggle. So on one hand, it emphasises the dominance of the individual over the state. You know, this whole idea of the individual responsibility if you're an Indigenous person. But on the other hand, it raises the social above the individual. And so in this way, neoliberalism can be offered as a rationale for coercive and interventionist policies, and for policies that promote that kind of free market activity. So it's about the individual, but it's about society, and the two work hand in hand. You know, it's complex. And so that's what I'd just like to do next, which is just to acknowledge that complexity. So we're certainly not saying it's just the Australian and its neoliberal agenda or neoliberal doctrine on the part of successive governments. You know, Labor, Liberal, it's all the same day. That's what our research would suggest. They're not the only things. They're not even the only media-related things that have contributed to the kind of coverage or the kind of media influence policy that we've got. So our projects found that policymakers are very closely attuned to the media, and that they shape their responses very much according to how they think public reaction will be to particular policies. You know, we've looked at the incursions at various times over the study period that groups have made. So at times Indigenous people have actually been incredibly successful in cutting through and being heard and shaping the debate. You know, they've got agency too, that's for sure. We've also looked at just the way that news routines, news values, you know, the changing media environment contributes to the way that things are reported, and as well as the personal experiences and the views of people that are involved in creating the news. So we've done a lot of interviews with journalists that have been incredibly inspiring, people that have been working in the Indigenous reporting field for years, such as Tony Kosh, you know, just amazingly, you know, that personal commitment to that kind of reporting has really made a huge contribution. And so what we're really interested in when we start to talk about these intersections of neoliberalism, you know, the state and the news media, and particularly the Australian, is, well, you know, what role does the media play in that? And we draw on the work of, you know, a number of scholars, but probably Nick Couldry, who's a British media studies scholar in particular, to talk about this. The power of representation is the power that the media has. So how does a paper like The Australian really play into this? It's through that power to present a particular point of view. The power of representation is what drives that. So you can create a very narrow view in that way. You block other possibilities from view. And I guess that brings me back to the graphs in a way, and to talking about Noel Pearson. Noel Pearson's the Indigenous voice of reason. Throughout my work on the project, you know, you meet people at a party or whatever and you tell them that you're doing a PhD and you see their eyes glaze over. But the one thing that people would say to me is, oh, that Noel Pearson, you know, he talks such common sense. And I'd smile, you know, in that scholarly way and say, yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly what he does. He is the voice of reason. He is the voice of common sense. How is that created? And that's something that we've been very interested in. And it's part of this business of aligning things. And so, you know, we've got numerous quotes. Everybody wanted to talk to us and offer an opinion about Noel Pearson. But we love this quote, you know, he's incredibly well connected. They just can't help themselves because there isn't any other Indigenous leader with the same credit rating. He's got the credit rating. And somebody that's, you know, quite critical of the Australians' sponsorship of Noel is again talking about this desire for simplicity and coming back to hegemony and common sense. That's what it is, this desire for simplicity in a very complex and difficult field. It's so simple, it's so appealing. So the only person, this guy's saying, that people want to talk to is Noel Pearson, that voice of reason that we can all understand, this clear path out of this intractable, wicked, however you want to name it, you know, policy domain. I was interested, listening to Paul Kelly, that he actually discussed the Australians' relationship with Noel Pearson as a collaboration. And I guess that's probably how we would see it too. And I'd be interested to know whether people like, in politics like Brough, Howard and certainly Abbott at the moment, whether they would also describe their relationship with Noel Pearson as a collaboration. I don't know, maybe that's a research question. But it's interesting. Pearson wasn't only the most quoted source, you know, we saw that graph before. He wasn't just the most quoted source. He was given an amazing opportunity. He wrote, between 2004 and 2011, 137 invited columns for The Australian. You know, that's a very powerful platform to be given. As I've said there, you know, he was a key source, and he's always referred to in The Australian as Indigenous leader. Noel Pearson. In the work I did on Daisy Bates, looking at her position, you know, way back there in the 1930s, and in the paper that I wrote about that, I talked about the incredible symbolic capital that she brought to her position, writing and advising government on Indigenous affairs. She had an awful lot of capital. And Noel Pearson has that too. So what can I tell you? You know, he's an Aboriginal Queenslander. He has deep cultural, political and economic capital. His writings convey a strong connection to land. He's a lawyer. He's a land rights advocate. He was the founding chair of the Northern Land Council. He sits as an advisor to government. And in 2004 he established the independent public policy organisation, the Cape York Institute for Policy. I could go on. You know, he comes with this incredible ballast to speak. He has legitimacy and he has agency. I'm not saying he's a puppet at all, but that capital that he brings to The Australian with all of its power creates what I've termed a singular influence. So you have this confluence of the state position, the media position, and an Indigenous person who, in a sense, becomes this singular voice of reason. He is not the government and he is not the Australian. And our research would suggest that he doesn't always agree with either the Australian's editorial line or the government's line on policy. But he is the anointed one. He is the Indigenous voice of reason in this country. And those invited columns and that go-to status that Noel has given him, just a voice that no other Indigenous person in this country can really compete with. Yes, the Australian has used other invited Indigenous columnists, powerful people like Marcia Langton, Warren Mundine, Galarrwuy Yunupingu. These people have all been invited to write and comment in the Australian, but they don't have the same capital. And perhaps the reason that Noel's in that anointed position of singular influence and one of those other people aren't is because their political agenda does not dovetail so neatly. So Noel has clearly articulated through his books, his essays, his writings, a neoliberal agenda for change in Indigenous Australia. So it dovetails very, very neatly. So, we're not in the business of disputing the Australians' commitment, its power, its passion for Indigenous affairs. Noel Pearson makes a huge contribution to the life of Australia. And we would just say that, basically he's articulated the discourse that's defined the policy agenda in this country. And we've got a quote there from Patricia Cavellis who... I skipped a slide, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Patricia Cavellis has even gone so far as to credit Pearson with convincing Howard of that agenda for change. So I come back to the point about Keystone Media. It's very easy to say that the Australians, the most influential media outlet in Indigenous affairs. But for our project, coming back and looking at the rest of the field and going back and looking at those graphs, looking at how the Courier Mail covers things, looking at how the Fairfax papers cover things, and even how the ABC covers things, that Keystone Media effect is that the Australian has basically set the media agenda and makes a huge contribution to the political agenda in Indigenous affairs. And I think it's really worthy of study, and it's really important to understand how these factors come together to shape the kind of public and policy discussion that we have in this country. So there are other ways of seeing Indigenous affairs apart from through a lens of neoliberalism and Indigenous people just having to pull themselves up by their boots. There are many voices out there, and the next stage of our work is to start looking at how Indigenous people are using social media and starting to think about how the media, the mainstream media and politicians might start bending their ears to that. Thank you.
Yes, these are items very sympathetic to the line you take, and I think you're quite right about the Australian and quite right about Pearson. But let me ask you about one phrase you used, a voice of reason, and ask you to think about ways in which you might unpack that. One of the things you don't say about Pearson is precisely his voice.